Several months ago, I was on a panel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the other panelists was Palestinian, and he noted that Palestinians, Jews, and Christians lived together peacefully in Palestine before large waves of Jewish immigration began in the late 1800s. He was telling the truth as far as that statement went. However, only a small fraction of the world's Jewish population lived in Palestine at that time, a reality that proved fatal to millions of European Jews. My fellow panelists argued that the movement to bring Jews to Palestine was European colonialism, with disastrous consequences for existing local populations, just as European colonialism was in India and in the Americas. This argument is grounded in the twin convictions that European Jews came up with Zionism in the late 1800s and are not indigenous to the land of Israel. The latter assertion is anti-Semitic, denying the truth of Jewish history as clearly revealed in sacred texts, by archaeology, and Jewish experience across the centuries. Jews never stopped praying for return to our sacred homeland after the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, and there was always a Jewish presence in the land. Something did happen in the late 1800s, though, and it did not start with Jews. Historian William Eichler explains. During the 19th century, European Christians began to identify as members of a nation. That is, the notion of seeing oneself as French or Polish, German, or Italian was rather new in the 1800s. Now, though, a new breed of nationalists glorified the historic triumphs of their people, rejoicing in the distinctiveness of their language and culture, and eventually demanding that their people become a nation state. The trouble for Jews, though, was that they were excluded from national identification in most of the places they lived, never considered French or Polish, Italian or Russian, but rather Jewish by nationality. Eichler notes that Jews didn't even get a chance to choose between their Jewish and, say, Lithuanian identities. Anti-Semitism made that choice a false one. Jews were almost universally excluded from European nationalisms. Eichler continues, Zionism emerged from this world as some Jewish thinkers concluded that the only way to secure their community would be to build a Jewish national home. Eichler cites the example of an early Zionist, Leon Pinsker, who argued that Jews would have to create their own national liberation, the only way we too could live and be a nation like all the others. In this week's Torah portion, Moses anticipates that the children of Israel would want to be like all the other nations, specifically, in that case, by having a king just like their neighbors. A sage known as the Vilna Gaon, writing about the time of the American and French revolutions, called that Israelite desire to be like the other nations blasphemy. We can well imagine why. Torah describes the Israelites' neighbors as idolaters and worse, and they often tormented the Israelites. The Vilna Gaon, though, might just as well have been writing about his own situation as a Jew in Vilna, now Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, but then in Poland. Jews there often faced horrific anti-Semitic persecution, and they understandably had a low regard for the people who oppressed them, their religion, and their nation. It's unsurprising, therefore, that the Vilna Gaon would reject the notion of being like the other nations. A century later, when modern Zionists began advocating for a nation-state like all the other nations, most Orthodox Jews dismissed that too as blasphemy, a view that would persist until the Holocaust rendered that position untenable. We would be different. God would establish any future Jewish sovereignty, unlike any other nations. Those Orthodox critics of modern Zionism were not alone. The founding rabbis of American Reform Judaism opposed Zionism in language that echoes the desire not to be like other nations. We recognize in the modern era of universal culture, of heart and intellect, the approaching realization of the Jewish people's great messianic hope for the establishment of the sovereignty of truth, justice, and peace among all people. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor the restoration of the laws concerning a Jewish state. In short, these rabbis, mostly immigrants to what they considered a golden land of promise, believed anti-Semitism would soon vanish among all the world's ills. No Jewish state would be needed, since Jewish Americans would be Americans like all others, distinctive in religion only, not a separate nation comparable to America itself. By 1936, with an increasing sensitivity to violent European anti-Semitism and the stubborn persistence of anti-Semitism in America too, the Reform position had shifted. In the wake of Hitler's rise to power in Germany, American Reform rabbis wrote, "In the rehabilitation of Palestine, the land hallowed by memories and hopes, we behold the promise of renewed life for many of our people. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life." These 1930s Reform rabbis did not speak of a state, certainly not like all the others, a point they drove home, proclaiming throughout the ages it has been the Jewish people's mission to witness to the divine in the face of every form of paganism and materialism. We regard it as our historic task to cooperate with all humanity in the establishment of the rule of God, of universal friendship, justice, truth, and peace on earth. This is our messianic goal. If those pre-Holocaust Reform rabbis had their way, the Jewish homeland would be a nation unlike any other. Nazism proved that the nation-state had failed. They used the word homeland, leaving open the possibility of a non-state entity that would be a refuge for oppressed Jews, a view forwarded even by some who called themselves Zionists in that day. That messianic hope would fade, of course, with the Holocaust and the British refusal to permit immigration to Palestine of Jews seeking refuge from the Nazis. A refusal, I hasten to add, demanded by Palestinians, whose leader was allied with Hitler. Yes, I'm speaking of those same Palestinians whom my fellow panelists described as living at peace with Jews a century earlier. That only lasted as long as Jews were a small, powerless, impoverished minority. Now, though, the Jewish people needed a nation-state with borders, a government, and the army that would be required to secure the safety of the Jewish people. In the wake of October 7th, Jewish people and our friends worldwide insist that Israel has a right to defend itself, like any other nation. At the same time, as early as the afternoon of October 7th, enemies of the Jewish people blasted Israel as a settler colonial state deserving of the massacre, with any retaliation branded genocide. Nations with infinitely worse human rights records, meanwhile, escape the world's opprobrium. Anti-Semitism has not vanished, but the Jewish people is now protected by a powerful standing army. Still, the dream of my predecessors, those Reform rabbis of the 1930s, inspires. Lu Yehi, if only Israel did not have to be a nation like all the others. Lu Yehi, if only we could believe that we live in a pre-Messianic era, universal peace, solidarity, and justice close at hand. Rather than despair, though, let us recall that the prophets who foretold a future of perfect peace lived in times more stricken even than our own. Still they prayed, Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, lo yilmedu od milchama. Let nation not lift up sword against nation, nor learn war anymore. Let that ancient prayer be our own today.